Hello again and welcome to another Warhammer 40k Imperial Guard Tactics video. Today we will be continuing our basic tactics series. The point of this series is to go through the different weapon options available to the Imperial Guard and cover them in quite a bit of detail. The point of the series is basically aimed at sort of newer players or people who have just started playing the Imperial Guard. Or it's also aimed at veteran players who maybe want a new take on things, but basically we go through the different weapons, their advantages, disadvantages, and where they are best used within your army. And the point of it is just to give people an idea of what the different weapons can do and whether they're any good or not, basically. So without further ado, let's get onto it. So we're going to be looking at the second of our budget heavy weapons. Now, what do I mean by budget heavy weapons? Basically ones that are cheap, cheerful, and you sort of get what you pay for. If it's cheap, it's only going to do a little bit of damage, but you don't really mind if it dies, basically. I do have also, I categorise weapon as like sort of elite / advanced weapon systems. They're the ones that are going to cost you quite a bit more, but generally are going to be the hard, heavy hitters of your army, the things that your enemy is going to fear. But for now, we're looking at budget weapon systems. We've already covered the heavy bolter, which is a good, standard, medium machine gun available to the Guard. Now we're going to look at another relatively conventional weapon, the Mortar. Now the Mortar is the cheapest of the heavy weapons available to the IG. It is only 5 points. And it's an anti-infantry weapon. It's plain and simple. What you get for your pretty measly 5-point investment is D6. It's a heavy D6 weapon, strength 4, AP minus nothing with a 48-inch range, and it can shoot units out of line of sight. Does not need line of sight to see its target. Basically, guys, you get D6 bolter shots. That's one way of looking at it. But the advantage of this is that you get to shoot people from 48 inches away, which is a long way away. Most of the time, that's the majority of the battlefield you'll be able to cover. And the best bit is you can hide out of line of sight. So, it being only D6 bolter shots, it's fairly obvious what this weapon wants to be shooting at. It wants to be shooting at infantry. Okay? Firing these things against vehicles is not recommended. If you absolutely, positively have to chip off the last wound from an enemy vehicle, then go for it. Otherwise, you shouldn't really be using mortars against those kind of targets. The Mortar, its main advantage is the fact that it can hide out of line of sight. What that means is you can take a little squad of 3 of these things, and you can just put them behind a building, behind a hill, even just behind a solid wall of your own guys. It's quite hard often for the enemy, especially if you rank them up properly. It can be quite hard for the enemy to see through all your men. So it's perfectly possible to hide them in plain sight almost. And the job is just to shoot at the enemy. And like I said, it's an anti-infantry weapon, guys. It's D6 bolter shots. Not much more to be said about it, really. It's just a good... You get what you pay for. It's 5 points, and it can do some damage. And it can sit an objective out of line of sight. Now, the Mortar has... Speaking of sitting on objectives out of line of sight, the Mortar has changed somewhat. It used to be able to get platoons in the Imperial Guard, for those of you that don't know. And platoons allowed you to take heavy weapon squads in your platoons, which meant that those heavy weapon squads were troop choices. Now we don't have that advantage anymore. So the Mortar has lost some of its appeal for being a nice, cheap objective holder. Because the problem is that they're no longer objective secured. It's perfectly possible for someone to take that objective off you. So that's the problem with mortar teams. They're no longer objective secured. But then again, they are half the price that they used to be. Now, speaking of heavy weapon squads and not being objective secured and stuff, we should say that they're now heavy support choice. Now, the reason that's important is because it means for a very cheap investment, I think it's 33 points, you can take 3 mortars in a heavy weapon squad, and they are really, really good at filling out cheap brigades. If you need to get yourself an extra 9 command points, the guard can do that for like, what, 500 points or something ridiculously cheap. Because 3 of these things, 3 heavy weapon squads of 3 mortars is 99 points. It's really, really good for filling out brigade choices. Slight disadvantage is that if you're not running a brigade, if you're running a battalion, then you only have 3 heavy weapon options. And that can mean that, especially if you're playing in a tournament, there's a lot of tournaments these days that are 1 detachment only. At most 2 detachments. And if you're playing in a small, low-level tournament with only 1 detachment allowed, it can be quite tricky because you don't want to waste one of your valuable heavy support slots on a mortar team. Yes, they're cheap, but they also take up a valuable slot. Now, it's not so bad if you've got access to as many detachments as you want. If you want to spam mortars, take a spearhead detachment and take 5 of these things. It won't cost you very much. It costs like 150 points. But like I said, it's advantages and disadvantages to them being in heavy weapon squads and being a heavy support choice now. Advantages, you can fill slots up quickly. Disadvantages, those slots might be very valuable. So speaking of sort of slots and whether, heavy support squads, where do you want to be taking the mortar? Do you want to be taking it in your infantry squads or heavy weapon squads or veteran squads? Well, the great thing about the mortar is it can be pretty much popped in anywhere. Thanks to the way that 8th edition has got rid of blast templates, it's now perfectly okay to put a mortar in pretty much any squad. Before, you didn't want to put mortars in squads like veterans because they had, ballistic skill, ballistic skill 4, which meant they hit on 3s. So there's no point with blast templates. Now, sticking a mortar in a command squad and putting a flag in that command squad and hiding it out of line of sight, and that command squad will then be able to contribute to the game. D6 shots, hitting on 3s, nice. It won't break the bank, and also means that it will be able to buff all the infantry around it without exposing itself to damage. If you've got a big ruin, line of sight blocking ruin in your deployment zone, it's perfectly possible for you to put the stack up in that ruin, multiple levels, cram it full of infantry squads, block all the windows with all your infantry squads so the enemy can't really see in very well, and then you could have a command squad in there with a mortar and a flag, and you could just sit there and give +1 leadership to everybody, and that's really good. A really, really cheap command squad, which I have run, and it's the budget command squad, is a command squad with a mortar, a flag, and a sniper rifle. For 36 points, you get a nice little unit, which you're really just taking 36 points for the +1 leadership on everybody. The fact that it can spit out some relatively decent firepower, D6 +1 strength 4 shots, if you include the sniper rifle. That's nice. Can't go wrong with that. Hitting on 3s, tasty. Don't need line of sight for most of it, even tastier. So it's good in a command squad. It's good in an infantry squad because they're cheap. If you're running like a proper pure infantry army, or an infantry heavy army, and you often find yourself you've got speed bump squads that are just going to take a lot of, are probably going to die first. It can often be a good idea to put a cheeky mortar in there. Now, some of you will be thinking, well, that doesn't make sense. If they're going to die anyway, then, why bother spending 5 points on them? Yeah, that's a good point if you know what you're going up against. But often, you won't know what you're going up against. And 5 points means that if you end up getting into a shooting match with your opponent, having, let's say you had 4 or 5 sacrificial squads, spending 25 points on giving them an extra bit of DACA could help you win the shooting war. Could help you do that. The thing with infantry squads is I wouldn't necessarily, the cheapest infantry squad you can get, pretty, with a heavy weapon and a special weapon, is an infantry squad with a grenade launcher, not a grenade launcher, a mortar and a sniper rifle. That's not too bad. If you really want to spam out a lot of shots, taking a grenade launcher and a mortar is a good idea. That's a lot of extra D6 shots. And throw down first rank fire, second rank fire on them. Put a bolter on the sergeant, and you've got, for 48 points, a squad that's going to be putting out a decent amount of anti-infantry firepower at long range, which is what you want to do. No, sorry, 51 points. Sorry, 48 if it had been a sniper rifle. 51 points gets you a grenade launcher and a mortar and a bolter. Not bad. That's decent. The reason I don't... Some of you might be thinking, why wouldn't you put a mortar on an infantry squad and put that infantry squad out of line of sight and then you get a little bit of obsec? Not a bad idea, but that means, one, hiding 10 guardsmen, 10 full guardsmen out of line of sight can actually be quite hard. 10 guardsmen is a relatively large footprint for line of sight blocking terrain. The enemy only has to be able to see one guy and they can shoot the whole squad. And two, it means you've got a lot of lasguns which aren't contributing to the fight. That mortar goes from being a 5-point investment to a 45-point investment. That's not worth it. For the same, for cheaper, you could take a mortar heavy weapon squad, and this is where I think mortars really should be taken. Okay, despite the problems with them, potentially taking up valuable heavy weapon slots, mortar heavy weapon squads are really, really nice. I've used them forever. I use them in 5th edition, 6th edition, 7th edition, and 8th edition. I use mortar squads when wyverns were the better choice because I like it. It's more fluffy. I don't know a lot about real world tactics, but I do know that there are mortar sections. People have full squads of mortars, and their job is to provide fire support to the rest of the platoon. I know that's a thing, and that's what these guys are. They're a good fire support unit. Now the mortar does have so I've said the advantage of the mortar is that it can, if you took a mortar squad, you could sit them out of line of sight, 3d6 bolter shots, tasty, target the enemy infantry. Problem with this is they have no AP, which means their favourite target, which is enemy infantry tucked away trying to camp objectives, they don't have any way of getting around the enemy's cover. So often, especially if you're trying to shoot these things at Marines in cover or scout snipers in cover, they're on a 2+ save because their ideal sort of target is things like enemy sniper units, because they can just blast away at sniper units from 48-inch range, and most snipers have only got a 36-inch range. So they do struggle against their intended target. However, there's going to be plenty of times when the enemy infantry is going to be running out across the open. If you spot enemy infantry, big globs of nid bugs or orcs or fellow guardsmen, if they're breaking cover, it's often best to give them a volley of mortar shells. And that's it, basically, guys. So the mortar is a cheap weapon. It's good for filling out weapon slots. Its main disadvantage, it doesn't really have any AP. The one thing to mention is, is which regiments get the best advantage out of mortars. Cadians, really, and Vestroyans. Cadians, because if you take 2 squads of mortars and a company commander, and that's 96 points, if they stay still, you can then order them to reroll all hits, which is quite nice. And Vestroyans, because then you get a 54-inch range mortar, which is just nice. Really good. So, hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Hope it's been useful and informative. I will be covering the other videos bit by bit throughout the next couple of weeks. Other weapon systems, I should say. But as always, leave lots of comments. Lots of if you've got any awesome mortar stories to tell. And of course, I'll see you guys next time.